On August 1st, 1667, Francesco Borromini sat down by lamplight to draft a new will. The summer sun had long since set over Rome, but this was nothing unusual. Borromini was the kind of man who kept company with the small hours, turning architectural problems over in his mind long after the rest of the city had gone to sleep. The house was quiet until around midnight, when his live-in stonecutter, Francesco Massari, came to check on him. He called in from the doorway, "Signore Cavaliere, you ought to put the light out and go to sleep, because it is late and the doctor wants you to sleep." "I should have to light the lamp again when I wake up," Borromini replied. "Put it out," Massari promised, "and I'll light it again when you wake." Borromini later recalled that he obeyed. He set down his pencil, filed away his papers, and surrendered the light. But sleep didn't come easily. The heat of a Roman August pressed in around him, and his mind, as it so often did, refused to quiet itself. Several hours later, he called out for the lamp to be relit. Massari said no. By the time the sun rose, Borromini would be fighting for his life. And to understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. The 17th century was a strange and electric moment to be alive. You had Rembrandt, Rubens, Descartes, Galileo, Newton, all of them living and working in this era, collectively dismantling old certainties and replacing them with something stranger and more luminous. It was an age that rewarded audacity and punished timidity. One of the arenas where this played out most visibly was religion. The Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's long, elaborate attempt to hold on to a world that was slipping out of its grasp, and one of its most powerful tools was art. Architecture in particular became something close to propaganda. Not in a cynical sense, but in the most literal one. If you wanted people to feel the presence of God, you built something that made them feel small and astonished and moved all at once. You built domes that rose above the city like portals between the earthly and the divine, guiding pilgrims from miles away toward the place where heaven and earth were meant to meet. You built something that reached. And nothing reached quite like St. Peter's. Construction on the new basilica had begun in 1506 under Pope Julius II, who had decided that the original 4th century church, built by the Emperor Constantine, crumbling after 1,000 years, needed to be replaced entirely. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that Julius wanted a church grand enough to house the enormous tomb Michelangelo was designing for him. Whether or not that's true, the ambition was real. Julius commissioned Donato Bramante, a painter-turned-architect with a gift for the monumental, to draw up plans for something that had never quite existed before. Bramante's vision was radical. He wanted to use a Greek cross plan, 4 wide arms radiating from a massive central dome, the whole thing organized according to the kind of rational geometric principles that the Renaissance believed the ancients had understood and the medieval world had forgotten. He wanted the building to feel like an argument, that the Catholic Church was the heir to the Roman Empire's greatness, and that its architecture could prove it. Bramante died in 1514, having barely gotten the foundations in place. What followed was one of the longest, most contentious building projects in history. For the next 50 years, a succession of architects, such as Raphael, Baldassare Peruzzi, and Antonio Sangallo the Younger, each took their turn, each brought their own ideas, and each left the building further from completion than the ambition demanded. The fundamental question kept reasserting itself. Should it follow Bramante's Greek cross, compact and centralized, or revert to the traditional Latin cross with its long nave stretching toward the entrance? Renaissance architects tended to favor the Greek cross, but the church's liturgical needs kept pulling toward the Latin. Nobody could agree, and the building sat in an extended, expensive state of incompletion that became something of a Roman joke. Raphael used the domeless center as a backdrop in the School of Athens, which tells you something about how long everyone had been living with the mess. Then, in 1546, Pope Paul III appointed Michelangelo. He was 71 years old and he didn't want the job, but he took it anyway, on the condition that he would accept no payment and answer to no one. He went back to Bramante's Greek cross, simplified it, made it more powerful, and reimagined the dome entirely. As a Florentine, he knew what Brunelleschi's dome had done for the skyline of Florence, the way it announced itself from miles away, the way it made the city legible from a distance, and he wanted something that would do the same for Rome. So he strengthened the piers, flooded the interior with light, and designed a dome that reached toward heaven with what his biographers described as a confidence bordering on the theological. But by the time he died in 1564, only the drum had been finished. But the idea was there, fixed in stone. By the early 17th century, the question of the Latin versus Greek cross had finally been resolved, in favor of the Latin by Pope Paul V, who appointed Carlo Maderno as architect in 1605 and instructed him to extend the nave. It was both a practical decision and a controversial one, because extending the nave meant that Michelangelo's facade and dome would be partially obscured from the piazza, a problem that architects and critics would spend the next century trying to solve. What remained of the original 4th century church was demolished in 1605, after part of it fell during a service. And with that, the final phase of St. Peter's, the phase that would involve Bernini and Borromini, began. Francesco Borromini and Gianlorenzo Bernini, more than almost anyone else, would define what Baroque Rome actually looked like. And although they would leave an indelible mark on the city, the question of how they did it and what it cost each of them is a story about something beyond architecture. It's a story about genius and power and what happens when an artist refuses to play the game. Gianlorenzo Bernini was born in Naples on December 7, 1598, the son of Pietro Bernini, a sculptor from a village north of Florence. Bernini grew up around marble and chisels, which probably made his first commission, carved somewhere around age 11 or 12, feel less like a miracle than an inevitability. But his real break came when Cardinal Scipione Borghese, the favorite nephew of Pope Paul V, summoned the boy to perform. Bernini charmed him so thoroughly that the cardinal brought him before the Pope himself. And Pope Paul asked him to draw a head, and Bernini asked, what kind? Realizing he was dealing with someone who could draw anything, the Pope asked for St. Peter, and Bernini delivered. It was the first of many auditions Bernini would ace in his life, and it established the dynamic that would define his entire career. Powerful men wanted him close, and he knew exactly how to make them feel that way. Paul arranged for the Vatican to oversee his education under Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, an investment that would pay extraordinary dividends when Barberini eventually became Pope himself. Bernini spent his childhood copying the Vatican's art collection, absorbing centuries of genius, and by the time he was 20, he was the most celebrated artist in Europe. He was, by all accounts, striking, with a long face, broad forehead, and dark eyes, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never really been told no. He was a sculptor first, and that sensibility never left him. Even his buildings feel carved rather than constructed, shaped by drama and light and the desire to overwhelm. His integrated approach to architecture, sculpture, and painting was called bel composto, a beautiful composition. And the name fits. His work doesn't ask you to appreciate its parts separately. It hits you all at once. And if pulling that off required charming a pope over dinner, or flattering a cardinal's taste, or making a room feel like it had been designed specifically for the person standing in it, well, that was simply part of the work. Francesco Borromini was born the following year, on September 25th, 1599, in Bissone, a small village on Lake Lugano, wedged between Italy and Switzerland, and dominated by mountains that loomed over its narrow streets like a permanent reminder that the world was larger and heavier than anything you could build. He came from stonemason stock, and his mother's family had produced two of the great late Renaissance architects, Domenico Fontana and Carlo Maderno, who, as it happens, was currently the lead architect of St. Peter's. Architecture was in his blood. At 10, he was sent to Milan to apprentice with a sculptor carving elements of the Duomo, and it was there, sitting in on the debates between the Lombard Gothic tradition and the Roman classical tradition, that the particular geometry of his imagination began to take shape. A decade later, in 1619, he left Milan without telling his parents, borrowing money owed to his father, heading south with a group of friends, and trusting that Rome would have something for him. When he arrived, a relative took him in. That relative's father-in-law was Carlo Maderno. Where Bernini moved through the world like a man who expected it to open for him, Borromini moved through it like a man braced for a fight. He dressed in black, he was suspicious of flattery, intolerant of criticism, and capable of holding a grudge with a ferocity that alarmed even his allies. His contemporaries described him as cerebral, melancholic, deeply religious, and nearly impossible to know. And yet his work was extraordinary. Where Bernini made you feel, Borromini made you think, embedding his buildings with a geometric and symbolic intelligence so layered that art historians are still unpacking it today. He didn't want to impress you. He wanted his buildings to mean something. Here's the thing about genius, though. It is not, on its own, enough. Especially not in a city whose entire artistic economy ran on personal relationships, papal favor, and the ability to read a room. To survive in Rome, an artist had to be equal parts creator and diplomat. Someone who could stay true to their vision while knowing exactly when to compromise, when to flatter, and when to simply smile and let someone else think they'd had the better idea. Bernini understood this instinctively. It was almost a second talent, inseparable from his first. Borromini understood it too, he just didn't much care. But that difference would shape everything that followed. Borromini's entry into Rome's architectural world was not through a grand commission or a papal audience. It was through his hands. When he arrived in Rome in 1619, Maderno put him to work as a decorative sculptor, carving the coats of arms, the cherubs, the balustrades that fill the margins of St. Peter's, and that most visitors walk past without a second glance. It was unglamorous work, but it was an education in the deepest sense. Maderno was, by this point, the most experienced man alive when it came to the practical realities of that building. Its weight distribution, its structural quirks, the way its foundations behaved under load. He was not a visionary architect exactly, but he was something equally valuable. A man who understood what the building could and couldn't bear. Working under him, Borromini absorbed that knowledge directly, detail by detail, stone by stone. Maderno was also, it seems, a genuinely decent mentor. He trusted Borromini with progressively more complex work as the years went on, eventually giving him responsibility for designing the lantern for the Dome of Sant'Andrea della Valle, the second largest dome in Rome after St. Peter's itself. By the time Maderno died in 1629, Borromini had worked on the Porta Santa, the holy door opened only on papal command, the angels around the doors of the basilica, the oval base of Michelangelo's Pietà, and the wrought iron decorations that run through the building like a quiet, intricate signature. He knew St. Peter's the way a surgeon knows a body, not just what it looked like from the outside, but what it was made of and where it was fragile. Then, in 1623, Cardinal Maffeo Barberini was elected Pope, taking the name Urban VIII, and the game changed entirely. Urban called the 24-year-old Bernini in and reportedly told him, quote, "It is your great fortune, Cavaliere, to see Cardinal Maffeo Barberini Pope. But our fortune is far greater, in that Cavaliere Bernini lives during our pontificate." End quote. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the sentiment was real. Urban kept Maderno on as lead architect of St. Peter's, but assigned Bernini to work alongside him, and his assistant Borromini, on both the Basilica and the new Palazzo Barberini. And then he told Maderno something that must have landed like a blade. The great bronze canopy that would stand over the altar at the spiritual center of St. Peter's, the commission Maderno had long aspired to and arguably deserved, would go to Bernini. Maderno was so ill with kidney stones by this point that he had to be carried around Rome. The Pope told him by one account that he would simply have to resign himself to watching Bernini do his work. Borromini, who had watched Maderno be humiliated, never forgot it. And he probably never forgave it. The canopy, known as the baldacchino, would take 9 years to build, from 1624 to 1633. To stand in front of it today is to understand immediately why it matters. Nearly 92 feet tall and weighing over 70 tons, it rises from the floor of St. Peter's like something that has no business existing. 4 twisted bronze columns spiraling upward, draped with tasseled bronze canopies, topped with a crown that seems to float rather than rest. It is simultaneously enormous and weightless, which is precisely the theological point. It marks the tomb of St. Peter, the spot where heaven and earth are meant to touch, and it was designed to look like the boundary between two worlds. It is Bernini's first great emblem of the Baroque, and it is rightly his. But what the Vatican records don't easily tell you is how much of the technical work was Borromini's. He was more skilled in the engineering than Bernini was, and he collaborated on both the design and the casting. The ribbing that holds the structure together, the calculations that kept 70 tons of bronze from pulling itself apart, that was Borromini's domain, and Bernini knew it and said nothing. When Maderno died in 1629, the question of who should become lead architect of St. Peter's arose. Borromini had given more of himself to that building than perhaps anyone then living. He knew its history, its structure, and its limits. He had earned that position in every way that could be measured by work. But he was passed over. The job went to Bernini, who was given it because the Pope loved him, and Borromini was somehow persuaded to stay on as his assistant. Bernini, who had always occupied the center of every room and had never had much occasion to think about the view from the margins, didn't seem particularly troubled by any of this. That indifference, not malice, just the breezy assumption of a man who had never been overlooked, was what Borromini found unforgivable. In January 1633, he received his last payment for work at St. Peter's, and after that, he was on his own. After the baldacchino, the two men went in opposite directions. And those directions say a lot about what each of them actually wanted. Borromini, with no wealthy patron and no papal favor to fall back on, began offering his services for free to the religious communities that couldn't afford a proper architect. In 1634, he found his way to a small order of friars called the Discalced Trinitarians, led by a man named Fra Juan de la Annunciacion, who was, by all accounts, nearly as difficult as Borromini himself. Fra Juan wanted something impossible, a building that expressed both the humility of man and the grandeur of God on a budget that could barely cover the stone. What he got instead was San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, and a permanent place in architectural history. The site was tiny, wedged into a corner where 4 streets and 4 fountains converged, and the constraint turned out to be kind of a gift. Borromini responded to the limitation the way he always did, not by simplifying, but by going deeper. The church that emerged from that cramped footprint is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most astonishing buildings ever constructed. Step inside San Carlo, and the first thing you notice is that the space refuses to resolve itself into something simple. The columns around the perimeter are arranged in rhythms that agitate rather than soothe, setting the walls in a gentle undulation that makes the room feel alive. There are no right angles in the traditional sense. The geometry is all curves, all movement, everything bending slightly away from what you expect. And then you look up. The dome overhead is an optical invention, and the shapes that fill it, the octagons, hexagons, and crosses, diminish in size as they approach the lantern at the top, creating an illusion of depth that makes the ceiling seem to recede into something beyond itself. It is a small building that feels bottomless. Borromini had taken the friars' poverty and turned it into a theological statement, the infinite contained within the finite, the divine glimpsed through the constraints of the human. The cloister tells a similar story. It should be a simple rectangle, as cloisters always are, but Borromini couldn't leave it alone. He angled the corner columns and curved the space outward at the midpoints so that what ought to be a quiet enclosure becomes something dynamic, a room that breathes. People who study architecture make pilgrimages to this cloister. And when it was finished in 1641, Rome had never quite seen anything like it. It became discussed more than praised, as one contemporary put it, which is the 17th century way of saying that people didn't really know what to do with it. Nevertheless, people begged to purchase copies of the plans, and Borromini refused them. Partly because he'd done the work for free and had no interest in profiting from it afterward, and partly, one suspects, because after what had happened at St. Peter's, he had no intention of giving anyone a blueprint for his genius. But San Carlo announced him, and commissions began to arrive. An altar for the Archbishop of Naples, work at Santa Anastasia for Cardinal Ulderico Carpegna, and crucially, a recommendation from Bernini himself for the position of head architect at Rome's university, La Sapienza. It was one of the last favors Bernini would ever do for him, and nobody is entirely sure why he did it. Theories range from genuine respect to a calculated attempt to keep Borromini quiet about what had happened at St. Peter's. Whatever the reason, Borromini got the job, and it would eventually give him the opportunity to build Santivo alla Sapienza, a building so geometrically inventive that it still defeats easy description, and one that would come to be considered among the most original architectural works ever conceived. And then came what seemed like his most important commission yet, the Oratorio di San Filippo Neri, to be built alongside Santa Maria in Vallicella for the Oratorians, a more prominent order with a more visible location. It was through the Oratorians that Borromini met Virgilio Spada, a nobleman and a man of refined taste, and one of the most influential architectural voices in Rome. Spada was the only person in the city who seemed genuinely able to like Borromini, who saw the architect's impossible personality as a price worth paying for what his mind could do. He would spend the better part of the next 3 decades advocating for him, and it would matter enormously. But even Spada couldn't fully protect Borromini from himself. Borromini had been brought on to assist the Oratorian's existing architect, Maruscelli, but within weeks he was suggesting revisions to the plans, and shortly after that, Maruscelli had resigned in frustration. Borromini completed the oratorio in 1640, only to watch the Oratorians immediately begin altering it with elements he hadn't approved. He was furious. By 1652, they replaced him entirely, a pattern that would repeat itself with increasingly costly consequences for the rest of his career. While Borromini was accumulating both commissions and grievances, Bernini's personal life was collapsing in a way that should, by any reasonable measure, have ended his career. He was a known womanizer, and his most consuming affair was with Costanza Bonarelli, the wife of one of his own assistants. We don't know much about Costanza before she entered Bernini's orbit, and there's nothing in his surviving writings that tells us what he actually felt about her. But the bust he carved of her in 1635 says enough. It is one of the few portraits he made that wasn't commissioned, and it has the charged, slightly reckless quality of something personal. She was, if not the love of his life, then the most vivid expression of the part of him that didn't calculate. But in 1638, word reached him that his brother Luigi had also become involved with Costanza. So one morning, he told his family he was leaving for the countryside, then drove instead to Costanza's house and waited. He watched Luigi leave, and then he followed him to St. Peter's and attacked him with a crowbar, breaking 2 of his ribs before something stopped him. He then chased Luigi back to their mother's house, broke down a locked door, and tried to get at him again with a sword. Luigi fled to the church next door, and Bernini apparently did not follow him onto this sacred ground. But he wasn't finished. He had sent a servant to Costanza's house to slash her face with a razor so that she may never again appear attractive to another man. Rome was scandalized, and charges were immediately filed because even in 17th century Rome, they didn't exactly take kindly to attempted murder. But Bernini's mother appealed to Cardinal Francesco Borromini, Urban's nephew and chairman of works at St. Peter's, who interceded on her son's behalf. Bernini was ultimately fined 3,000 scudi, roughly what a cardinal might pay for one of his sculptures, and the matter was quietly closed. But even still, Bernini fell into a depression that manifested as fevers, which forced him to stop working for a period. And eventually, at Pope Urban's urging, he married Caterina Tezio, a lawyer's 22-year-old daughter. By all accounts, it was a genuinely happy marriage. But at almost exactly the same time his personal life was unraveling, Bernini walked into the worst professional crisis of his career. And at the center of it, quiet and technically precise and waiting, was Borromini. The problem had roots that went back further than either of them. In 1612, Pope Paul V had decided he wanted 2 campanili, or bell towers, built at either end of the facade of St. Peter's. Maderno, who knew the building, had wanted something modest, placed close to the entrance. But the Pope wanted something grand. The Pope won, as popes generally do, but in 1618, workers discovered a subterranean spring beneath the southern foundations. Exactly the kind of structural complication that Maderno had been trying to avoid. But construction pressed on anyway. And when Paul V died in 1621, both towers were still rising on foundations everyone quietly knew were compromised. When Bernini inherited the project in 1637, he did what Bernini always did. He made it bigger. He scrapped Maderno's modest designs and proposed 3-story towers that would cost nearly 70,000 scudi and transform the St. Peter's skyline entirely. Everyone applauded. 2 master builders were brought in to assess the foundations, and they declared them sound. So Bernini proceeded. Borromini, who had spent years inside the bones of that building and knew exactly what those foundations could bear, said the towers would be too heavy. But nobody listened. By June 1641, the third story was ready to be set in place. So Pope Urban came to inspect, and he didn't like what he saw. Bernini had quietly modified the upper story to reduce the weight on the struggling foundation, and the result was too timid for Urban's taste. So he ordered it torn down. Bernini fell ill with one of his stress-induced fevers, and the murmuring in Rome grew louder. And then, in July 1642, came the formal decree. All work on the towers was to stop indefinitely. Pope Urban died on July 29, 1644, with work still halted. And within 2 weeks, Bernini had written to Cardinal Mazarin in France, essentially asking whether the French court would have him. They said yes, and although he didn't leave, the fact that he was already looking for an exit tells you everything about where he thought things were headed. 6 weeks after Urban's death, Cardinal Giambattista Pamphili was elected pope as Innocent X, a man who had come to power on a platform of undoing his predecessor's extravagances and who had no particular attachment to Bernini. In fact, one of his closest advisors was Virgilio Spada, who did have a very particular attachment to Borromini. Innocent gave Bernini a chance to explain himself about the bell towers, and Bernini, careful and strategic even in retreat, acknowledged the cracked foundations and suggested that independent inspections be made. In early 1645, investigators descended into narrow shafts beneath the basilica to examine the damage firsthand. Among them was Francesco Borromini. On March 27, 1645, the Congregation of Architects and Officials convened to hear their findings. Bernini was not present, but Borromini was, and his testimony was unsparing. He presented drawings demonstrating that the South Tower was 3 times taller and 6 times heavier than the foundations had ever been designed to support. This was not a man offering a diplomatic opinion. This was a man who had been right from the beginning, who had been ignored, and who was now in a room full of people who finally had to listen to him. Bernini attempted to manage the fallout through back channels, appealing to Virgilio and his brother to soften the damage. And it worked, partially. The congregation ultimately concluded that the issue was a matter of placement rather than pure negligence, which spread the blame thin enough to protect Bernini from total ruin. But Innocent had made his decision. The towers would come down to the roofline. Evidence suggests Bernini's investments were seized to offset the costs. So he retreated back to sculpture, the first love that he had never really abandoned. For Borromini, it must have felt like a vindication so complete and satisfying. Bernini was in disgrace. A new pope was in power, with Spada at his ear. And Borromini was about to receive the greatest commission of his life. After a decade of being overlooked, undercut, and ignored, he had finally won. But what he didn't understand, and what he would spend the rest of his life failing to understand, is that in this city, in this world, you don't win once and walk away. The game doesn't end. It just changes players. And Bernini, even humiliated, even exiled to the margins, had been playing since he was 11 years old. He knew how to wait. Next time on Verso, Borromini's greatest commission, Bernini's most audacious power play, and the fountain that changed everything.
This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, If something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.